The Darkangel, Chapter 4. A Spindle of Fallow Gold. Learning to use the spindle proved long and difficult. Iriel spent hours in her chamber. She had found a small bare room in the servants' quarters to serve as hers. Sitting with the spindle, going through the motions of back-spinning a few threads of non-existent fibre, securing them with a half-hitch, then giving the spindle a twist to set it spinning and letting it drop, just as she'd done with her spindle of ram's horn at home. Nothing availed. Instead of producing thread on which to hang and twist, the golden spindle inevitably dropped to the floor with a clear, heavy clink, and sat there turning like a top until it fell over. Try as she might, Iriel could not master its mechanism. The day-months passed. The wraiths, of course, were no help. She went to visit them often as promised, but they were so horribly thin and dreary, and complained so bitterly at the weight of their coarse, drab garments, that she could bear them for not longer than an hour at a time. The gargoyles, too, she took to visiting, though she was careful never to approach close enough to be scratched or bitten. She brought them fish and mushrooms that she gathered in the caves. They looked so starved, and their eyes were filled with such pain, that she could scarcely help but feel pity for them. After she had come to them several times, they began to look for her, to yap and yelp the moment they heard her step on the tower stairs. Gradually, as the day-months passed, they grew less bony, even sleek. Their eyes lost their wild gaze, and they ceased to howl and shriek so terribly on the long fortnights. And then suddenly, Iriel discovered the working of the spindle. She'd been practicing, striving with it, trying for hours to cajole it into producing a thread. This it had stubbornly refused to do, and slowly as she went through the motions of spinning without thread, she fell into a kind of daydream, remembering her first spinning lesson at the age of 4, in the spinning room amongst the other women, spinning their white wool with absent-minded ease. Bomba had put the ram's horn spindle into her hands, shown her how to draw and twist back the wether's wool into the beginning of a thread, how to wrap it around the base and secure it at the top notch in the shaft, then let the spindle fall and turn while she drew the wool in thin tufts through her fingers, and let them twist away as the spool of ram's horn dropped down, slowly down. It seemed an eternity until it touched the ground with a click and fell over. But the sound Iriel heard now, as she stood in her room in the vampire's castle, was not the soft click of old bone on hard-packed earth, but the bright clink of gold on stone. She looked down, and there at her feet lay the spindle still turning idly, with a coarse white thread twisting up from the shaft. Quickly, before she could lose the knack, Iriel snatched up the spindle, wound the thread, and let the golden spool drop. The thread did not break, and continued to form, though it was thick and ragged as a gasp. It must be amazement, thought Iriel. That's what I'm spinning, for I'm amazed to be spinning at all. After that she took the spindle with her when she visited the wraiths, and she spun there. At first she could find only pity to spin for them, a coarse, dull thread like the garments they wore, and then when after a few hours in the wraiths' company she could stand them no more, sometimes the thread turned wholly loathing, sticky and stinging as a bruised nettle stem. Then she could leave them and go down to the caves to bathe in the warm water or talk to the Durra, and after a while she would go back to the wraiths and take up the spindle again, twisting a thick thread of coarse dull pity out of the air, and the day-months passed. And then one day it all changed. The wraiths had become familiar to her now, though their bodies were even thinner than when she first seen them. Their pitifully dull wits actually seemed to have improved slightly as she spent time with them and talked to them. Glimmerings of memory came to them now, though when Iriel pressed them, none were able to distinguish between glimpses of their own past lives and snatches recounted by a sister wraith. Iriel still could not determine which of them was Edwin. Indeed, was not entirely sure she could have borne the knowing. Gradually, though, she was beginning to come to tolerate them, even take with good humour the whining whispers of her charges. Despite the vampire's words, they were not really mistresses. Their nagging insistence that the thread she was spinning was too heavy and coarse. She had run out of loathing, and though they were painfully eager for attention, she tried not to pity them, and one day while she sat spinning, she found the thread passing through her fingers was growing thinner and finer. Then the sudden coarseness went out of it completely, and then she realized she was spinning patience now, and love followed fast behind, whereas an ounce of pity had spun only a skein of thread, and loathing even less. A drop of charity made the thread so fine and long that she had not yet reached the end of it. And whereas the spinning of pity and loathing exhausted her after only a few hours' work, charity and patience was the easiest spinning she'd ever done. Soon she was weaving kirtles for the wraiths on an old hand loom she'd found abandoned in one corner of the cellar. The work was light and taxed her not at all. Once, after several day months had passed, 3 or 4, she did not count them, she saw through a window the Darkangel standing on the ramparts of a balcony that jutted from the castle overlooking the garden. She stopped to look at him. It was the first time she'd seen him in a long turn of stars, perhaps even since the last day month. The Icarus stood gazing out over the plain. His wings sloped down from his shoulders like a thick cape of black velvet that swallowed the light of Solstar and gave none of it back in a sheen. His face was as fair as limestone, perfectly immobile, as though chiselled of stone, but his colourless eyes roved aimlessly over the barren landscape. He turned suddenly and saw her. Startled, Iriel drew back from the window, but he called to her. Not by name, she did not think she'd ever told it to him. "You girl!" And she went out to him. For when he looked at her straight on, his clear eyes meeting hers, her strength failed her. She could do no other than to obey him. He turned away from her and gazed again over the plain. "Someone has been feeding my gargoyles," he said. "Was it you?" "Yes, my lord," she answered softly. "I did not give you permission," he said, shortly, still looking out over the land. "No, my lord," she said. "Why?" demanded the vampire, still not looking at her. "Why did you do it?" "They were so hungry, my lord," said Iriel. He looked at her now, and seeing again the cold beauty of his face, Iriel felt weak. "I like them kept lean," he said. "They make better watchdogs then." It was not until he looked away that Iriel found her tongue. "Their eyes will be sharper and their ears the keener if they are not distracted by hunger," she began. "Do you propose to argue with me?" snapped the Icarus. "No, my lord," said Iriel softly. The vampire drummed the fingers of one perfect white hand on the battlements. They gleamed slightly like lambent averic against the dull dark stone. "Tell me, how did you manage not to be killed by them?" "Their chains are not long enough to let them come near me if I stand against the stair." The Darkangel nodded, then turned to glance at her over one night-winged shoulder. "You knew this before you went up." She shook her head, for she could not speak while he watched her. "Then why did you go up?" he asked her. "They needed someone to feed them," she stammered as his eyes wandered. "They would have killed you if they could," said the vampire. She answered yes. "Then why?" he said, with a real curiosity now. "Why did you go up?" Said Iriel, "They needed me." The Darkangel shook his head and then laughed. "I suppose I should kill you," he said, idly at last. "I did forbid you to go up on the tower, but I shall not. You are interesting. Not one of my servants was ever brave enough to go up amongst the gargoyles before, much less disobey me." He shook his head, frowned very slightly. "Strange. You do not look brave." He eyed her as though he expected some answer, and she looked away. "I am not brave, my lord." He laughed again. "Perhaps not. Perhaps you are only stupid. No matter. Henceforth you shall feed my gargoyles as well as attend my wives." He paused, then expecting another reply, and Iriel murmured, "You honour me, my lord." "But keep them lean," he said, with a sudden severity. "If I ever discover them growing fat and sleepy, you will be their last meal for a long 12-month. With that he strode away from her and disappeared into the castle. Iriel leaned against the terrace wall for many moments after, waiting for her heart to steady and her strength to return. As the day months wore on, Iriel became aware the vampire was growing more restless, pacing the castle and muttering. "He is growing hungry," said the wraiths. Their wits gradually were sharpening. 8 of them had new kirtles now. "Half the year is up," the Dora told her. "In a few months' time he will fly in search of another bride." Iriel often caught glimpses of him prowling through the keep. Sometimes he caught little silver bats that flew about the towers after dark in search of tiny moths and millers. The Icarus caught the bats and broke their wings. This Iriel knew, for sometimes she came upon them starved to death on the walks about the keep, or fluttering helplessly across the floor of some empty castle room. One day in the garden she came upon him. Cupped in his hands he held some tiny struggling creature. A bat, she realized in a moment. It was a bat. He'd broken only one of its wings and was tossing it into the air, to watch it flutter back to earth in a frantic spiral. Iriel could just make out a high, thin twittering on the very limits of her hearing. Before she could think, she found herself running forward. "Stop!" she cried out. "Stop!" The vampire ignored her. The bat struck the cobbles of the walk and ceased to move. The Icarus nudged it tentatively with one sandaled foot, then picked it up by its crumpled wing and shook it. The bat did not stir. Iriel stood watching. "Don't!" she cried. "Please don't throw it up again. It's stunned. You'll kill it." The vampire laid the bat down on the garden wall long enough to look at her. Her voice trailed away and died. The Icarus eyed her a long moment with his eyes clear and colourless as quartz. Then he glanced back at the bat. Its black eyes stared at nothing, glazed. Its mouth hung open a little, its tiny white sharp teeth as rose pricks. Iriel could see the slight swift rise and fall of its fragile side as it breathed. The Darkangel shrugged. "I am done with it," he said. "It no longer amuses me." He brushed it off the wall and over the precipice with one brief motion. Iriel closed her eyes and turned away. A long moment passed before she could speak. "Why?" she said, not looking at him. "Why do you torment them?" "For sport," he answered readily. "I am bored. This castle bores me. My wives bore me. I must have some amusement." Iriel opened her eyes. "Need you have killed it?" She was still unable to face him. The Icarus shrugged again. She could hear the rustle of his dozen wings. "Why not?" he said. "There are others." "Must you catch them all?" asked Iriel. "It is so cruel." "Oh, lizards are even better sport than bats," the vampire replied. "One can bait them with moon moths, then pick out their eyes or tear out their tongues." If he continued, Iriel did not hear. She covered her eyes and her ears with her hands. Even then she could hear the Darkangel laugh at her. "You are even more sport to bait than the lizards," he said, when she took her hands from her ears again. "There are pleasanter forms of amusement than the tormenting of helpless creatures," said Iriel. "Are there?" said the vampire. Iriel felt her skin shrink as he stepped closer and eyed her. "What do you do to amuse yourself?" Iriel turned quickly from him and gazed out across the garden. "When I was young," she said, "when I lived in my village in the foothills on the edge of Avery's white plain, Bomba would tell us tales." "Bomba?" said the Icarus, drawing back a trace. "Bomba?" He pronounced the name as though he found it absurd. "Who is this Bomba?" "My nurse," said Iriel. "No, Edwin's nurse, really." Her throat tightened and her heart turned at the thought of Edwin. Even in the company of the wraiths, Iriel had not thought of Edwin now in months. She found it impossible to think of the wraiths as women. She could not imagine any of them had ever been a living maid as Edwin had been, but the vampire was speaking. "You shall tell me a tale," he said. Iriel looked at him. "Now?" she asked. "Yes, now," he said impatiently. His eyes bored into her like a hawk's. Iriel swallowed and cast about her for a tale. "Well?" the Icarus inquired. "I shall tell you the tale of the Maiden Eater," she told him, and she began. The tale was a long one, about a kingdom besieged by a dragon and the king's daughter who slew it and the young hero who helped her. The vampire laughed outright when she came to describing the room. "Big as a cottage," he cried at last. "With wings? It's evident you've never seen a fire drake. They are 20 and 30 times so large, and they certainly cannot fly, though they swim. Incidentally, they do not spit brimstone, they breathe sulphur and flame." The Icarus folded his arms and leaned back, looking down on her, his lips curled in contempt. No mere mortal could have killed one single-handed. "Her sword was magic," said Iriel. "The dragon would have killed them both long before she could have used it." Iriel looked at the ground. "You've seen dragons, my lord?" "Oh, yes, my mother keeps a pair as pets." Iriel looked at him. "Your mother?" she said. The words sounded strange from his tongue. His lips twisted again into a smile. "I do have a mother," he said. "How do you suppose I came to be?" His tone was amused and had no kindness in it. Iriel dropped her eyes and mumbled something. The Icarus pursed his lips a moment and his look grew further away. "She's very beautiful, my mother." Iriel let a moment go by before she spoke. "What is her name?" she ventured at last. "And how would I know that?" replied the vampire, affronted. "Great personages such as she do not hand out their names so freely." "But you are her son," insisted Iriel softly. The vampire suddenly looked away, and for the first time his cool assurance flagged. She will tell me, he began. She has promised to tell me when I come of age. And is she like you? Asked Iriel, wondering what sort of being mothered vampires. His hesitation surprised her. You mean a winged Icarus? He asked, regaining himself and flexing his coal dark feathers. They rustled like fine stiff silk. No, she prefers water to air. She's a Lorelei. And she keeps dragons. Yes. A moment's silence followed as the Darkangel settled his wings. When next he spoke, it was with no trace of his former faltering. But hers do not eat maidens, they eat ships. Ha ha ha. He laughed again, that same cruel and careless laugh. Ah, tell me that silly tale you told. It was amusing enough, and tell me another. His tone had taken on a keen edge at last. My lord, Iriel stammered, I am hungry and tired. I've just spent many hours spinning and weaving for your wives. She had to catch herself lest she in his presence say the wraiths. And he held up his hand suddenly tolerant again. Ah, yes. I sometimes forget you mortal creatures need inordinate amounts of food and sleep. I need only a little and a little. He gave her a dismissive nod. Very well, go have your food and rest, and then come to me in the audience hall, where you shall tell me more of these tales.